And I still, to this day, Counsel, don't see anything wrong with taking the Ayatollah's money and sending it to support the Nicaraguan freedom fighters.
The Iran-Contra Affair was, in its entirety, a proxy war between the socialist Nicaraguan government and the Nicaraguan Contras, which were the rebel groups supported by the United States. In 1979, the Nicaraguan government, termed the FSLN, was responsible for ousting the previous dictatorship and changed the country's ideology to socialism. President Reagan was against this, and viewed this change in government and policy as a communist incursion. He believed that America's sphere of influence surrounded the whole of North and South America, and attempted to oust the communist foothold in Nicaragua, much like Kennedy did in regards to Cuba in the 1960s. His support came by the way of funds, smuggled secretly into Nicaragua by the CIA. This was done without official records and was labeled top secret. By 1984, liberal members of Congress were unhappy with the support, seeing it as immoral and even illegal, leading them to propose and pass the Bolin Amendments. These amendments prohibited government agencies from providing aid of any kind to the Contras. The Reagan administration did not agree with Congress's ruling on the matter, and Reagan himself stated that the aid to the Contras must not stop. This was said by his national security advisor.
He had been very adamant at the time that he says, look, I don't want to pull out our support for the Contras for any reason. This would be an unacceptable option.
To get around this limitation and still oppose communist forces, the Reagan administration used the National Security Council, or NSC, which was not directly covered by the amendments. The NSC used Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North in their operations, and he acted as the principal go-between for all parties involved with the NSC. They rose private and foreign funding, sometimes from rich American investors and businessmen with the promise of entering White House politics. Men such as Joseph Coors, owner of the Coors Brewing Company, pledged large sums of money to the NSC.
I told him that I was interested in seeing what I could do, and I asked him for his recommendations.
And did North, subsequent to the meeting, provide you the Swiss bank account name and number to which your payment should be made?
Yes, he did.
As with Coors, many other investors and businessmen were approached by North. These included Ellen Garwood, who delivered $2.5 million, and William O'Boyle, an investment banker. They were all given instructions on how to deliver sums of money into CIA-controlled Swiss bank accounts that were later used to send money to the Contras. From foreign groups, the United States managed to gather $1 million a month from the King of Saudi Arabia and $10 million from the Sultan of Brunei. Under Robert McFarlane and John Poindexter, the NSC also raised funds by selling arms to Iran, despite the U.S.'s arms and trade embargo. To do this, they used Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who oversaw all dealings for the NSC. North and his accomplices set out to create a network of companies and bank accounts in order to bypass Congress's legislation against the aid of the Contras and traffic money secretly into Nicaragua. After the leak in Iran about the arms sales, a Lebanese magazine soon exposed the agreements and accounts on November 3, 1986. Soon after, the Iranian government confirmed the story. U.S. President Reagan at first denied all accounts of the story in an effort to cover up the government's illegal dealings, both with private investors and foreign groups, as to continue his support of anti-communist actions in Nicaragua.
Has been made that the United States has shipped weapons to Iran as ransom payment for the release of American hostages in Lebanon, that the United States undercut its allies and secretly violated American policy against trafficking with terrorists. Those charges are utterly false.
However, his White House staff appeared on television on November 25th, also confirming the agreements.
Certain monies which were received in the transaction between representatives of Israel and representatives of Iran were taken and made available to the forces in Central America which are opposing the Sandinista government there.
In the following months, the Reagan administration continued to attempt to cover up the story, as Reagan demanded that his ability to fund the Contras must not cease. However, as it was discovered in the trials, the money system devised by North was actually producing a profit off of weapons sales, and the weapons were given to the Contras at many times their market price.
If the purpose of the enterprise was to help the Contras, why did you charge Calero a markup that included a profit?
We were in business to make a living, Senator. We had to make a living. I didn't see anything wrong with it at the time. It was a commercial enterprise.
Oh, I thought the purpose of the enterprise was to aid Calero's cause.
Can't I have two purposes?
All right.
I did.
At the time, Iran was using these weapons against Iraq, which yielded approximately 1 million deaths from those weapons alone. As it also turned out, the Contras were fighting a guerrilla war against civilians more than against the government's armies, as to pressure the government rather than attack them. This meant that the United States was fighting a feud between two nations, as well as funding what can only be described as simple terrorists. In the short term, the affair placed severe distrust between American lawmakers and the American president. Oliver North was fired and tried on criminal charges, and Poindexter resigned. Reagan's popularity as president dropped from 67% to 46% in under a week. In the long term, America was seen as a hypocrite. It ignored its own democratic laws and policy in order to achieve its own ends against communism. It also showed that the U.S. was incapable of functioning as one entity, but only as combinations of smaller parts that were in disarray and dysfunction. This substantially lowered America's prestige in world affairs, both from the point of view of its allies and the point of view of the USSR.